And the front line is the kupunas, the elders, right? Like these elderly women, some of them in wheelchairs, just lined up. We are not going to move. We will not move. And, interviewing, in interviews, some of them had said, I have made peace with the fact that I may die here, right? Like imagine valuing something so much that you say, I am okay with the idea of dying to protect this place, right? Because that's how you feel about your kids, right? Like I'm going to die to protect my kids.
Yes.
And that is a very indigenous way of relating to the land, right? Because that is what we're taught. Like this is your ancestor, right? This is your land. This is your, right? Like the way that we understand relationship to water and to land is familial. It's not ownership.
Greetings, Unhidden Voices family, and welcome to episode 32. Before we start this episode, I want to send my condolences to Baba. He passed away, and his funeral, his janaza prayer, is today. The last time I saw him was a year ago before the pandemic started, and I had started wearing my hair like this, and he said, we were in a restaurant, and he said, "Sister, you look like a queen." And so that was the last interaction I had with him. Sending my condolences to the family. From Allah we come, to Allah we go, and praying that he receive the highest station in Jannah. Also, we have some congratulatory messages to send out. Sadiq and Tasneem and Zainab all graduated. Sadiq received his AA degree from City College of San Francisco in Film and Media Studies. Tasneem received her bachelor's degree from the New School in New York. And Zainab received her bachelor's degree from Mills College in Oakland. So many celebrations for the family. And last year, I actually was promoted to associate professor and received early tenure at Sacramento State University. And because it happened during the pandemic, I didn't get a chance to celebrate. So we're going to celebrate now, and we're really excited. And congratulations to everyone. The other thing that I wanted to do was just introduce this episode. This is an interview that I did with Natalee Kehaulani Bauer. Natalee is a dear friend of mine, a sister. We met in graduate school at UC Berkeley, and Natalee is talking about resistance in solidarity and how we have to work in solidarity with different communities. So please listen to this episode. Please like it. If you like it, subscribe to our podcast. Listen, learn, and amplify with us. Okay, first of all, oh my gosh, I'm so excited to talk to you. And I feel like everything you're saying, it's just resonating with me, just listening to you and just hearing your voice and the way that your spirit. And so I just have to express that and just my joy, and I wish this was like face to face, but this is like the next best thing because we're seeing each other, so.
Yeah.
That being said, I think it's important for our audience to hear you and hear what you're saying, and we're speaking about solidarity in this moment. And so I just felt like you're dropping such knowledge, and I was like, we can't have that happen without
Press record.
So I know I totally interrupted your flow, but
no, it's so it was. I was saying it is something I think about teaching ethnic studies to undergrads, and especially at least once a year I get to teach the intro class. So it's a lot of brand new, the wide-eyed students. Some of them have been lucky enough to have heard these things because they've, ethnic studies is starting to creep down into high school. But for a lot of them, it's like every day their mind is blown. Mm-hmm. And depending on what their identity is, right, their experience is, when we teach in person, it's like I can see the energy a little bit more. Like they kind of walk out of the room at the end of the day, and some of them just kind of like really heavy, mm-hmm. or some of them just sort of like bewildered, and it's hard, I think. So I guess what I was talking about earlier was, what they learn from ethnic studies and what they learn from learning history through an ethnic studies lens is like, damn, we've just been struggling forever. Like, will this never end? And so what's helpful for me to reframe that is, yeah, we've been resisting forever. right? Like that says something about you, that says something about your ancestors, that says something about the system, right? Because we know they recognize that struggle as a threat. And so what I was saying earlier before the press record was, you know, is that so one of the things that students learn in the intro class is about the way the state has consistently worked to dismantle interethnic solidarity movements. Whether this is, you know, like way back between like the working class Irish and you know, either enslaved or recently freed descendants of Africans, right? And so we have this whole history of, I think students hear it and they learn it just never works, right? Because the people with power come in and they dismantle these solidarity movements. Um, and so for I think my job, what I find helpful both to kind of like keep everybody's sanity, but to like really give them perspective is, you know, like trace it all the way back though. There's always been these movements. There's always been, and you know, like when I talk to them about like the Hawaiian sovereignty movement and folks like Haunani K. Trask, she came to Santa Cruz and studied with Angela Davis. You know, she studied Malcolm X. She, you know, like she she grew up in that knowledge.
Yeah.
And so we have that Black political movement um, to trace back in our lineage, right? To be grateful for. And she brought that back and didn't bring it back like, okay, here's this thing that I learned, right? Like she always kept that connection. And we've always had folks, and especially now that we're more connected with, you know, Instagram, all these newfangled apps and things that the young people use. You know, like we've have folks who have made, like Joy Enomoto, who's at University of Hawaii, you know, like who've consistently pushed us to say, okay, if we're going to fight for Hawaiian sovereignty, if we're going to fight for Mauna Kea, then we have to also talk about how there's real anti-Blackness steeped in this movement and in our culture, right? And that plays out with even amongst Polynesians, like the way that Melanesians and Micronesians are seen in Hawaii, for example. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess the point we were talking about earlier was just, you know, the reason that our interethnic solidarity movements have been dismantled, why so much energy has been put into it, is because, you know, like the state, like the government, like they recognize that's where the power is, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that, you know, at least here in the Bay Area, our students get to see in person how that works. So they will see, you know, my good friend Corina Gould of the Sigorte Land Trust and Oloni Elder, you know, they've seen her show up at all of the Black Lives Matter marches.
Yeah.
And likewise, you know, when she's trying to hold it down at 4th Street and, you know, like maintaining, protecting the shell mounds and sacred sites, we have folks who have like flown in from Hawaii to be there, right? Or we have leaders, Oakland Black leaders who are there, right? Or other, you know, like leaders in the Asian community, like who are there, who are at those movements, showing them that, you know, like it's not just my struggle that I have to work towards, like I need to show up for these people.
Yeah.
My sidekick yelling in the background.
Hey, hi.
What do you need, Kayla? She just almost always wants a snack. More food. More snacks. Yeah, I'll do it in just a sec, okay? Yeah, so I mean that's important to me, and for me, you know, starting to see this happen for real, not just reading about it. I think it started for me like around during the Dakota Access Pipeline protest.
Absolutely, yeah.
And seeing that just Indigenous folks from all over the globe flew in and held ceremony there, you know, and how even some of our leaders in the Hawaiian sovereignty movement, in land protection movements, they were there for that. And one of them, you know, a friend, Dr. Kalama Okaina, was there as was one of the medics. And so because our folks were there standing for them, they actually learned, okay, this is how the state rounds people up. This is how they like surrounded the camp. This is how they made it so no one could escape. This is what their tactics look like, right? And then they also learned You know, like, this is how you set up a medical tent, and this is how you keep people healthy and safe. And so when it was time to go back to the Mauna, they were ready. They had that knowledge, you know. And yeah, so for me, that was really like the first moment when I could see the pieces kind of falling together and happening, you know.
Yeah. Okay. So I have two questions.
Because that was all over the place.
No, but I think I like let you go. But I want, because I think our audience, you know, for education purposes, needs to know, what is the Hawaiian Solidarity Movement? And can you talk a little bit more about that? And then also specifically, you mentioned like the Dakota Access Pipeline. I know what that is, but people may not be aware of that. So can you explain that, both of those?
Yeah, and just a short explanation. Okay, so let's see. Where to begin? You know, there's a really great book called A Nation Rising that I recommend folks get and read. It tells these generations of history of the political struggle that's been going on in Hawaii, right? So the short version of it is Hawaii is not a state legally. It's illegally occupied by the U.S. government. Our own government has admitted that. Several of them, you know, President Clinton issued a proclamation. It's called the Apology Bill, right? Because he basically said, "Oh, I'm sorry. You know, we shouldn't have done that. It wasn't done right." But you know, we're still going to keep your land and cover it with our military. But you know, my bad. We and so Hawaii has never given up that sovereignty, right? The Queen never gave up that sovereignty. She was forced to abdicate her throne. You know, it was American businessmen, not quite the U.S. It's tricky at this time, right? So American businessmen basically forced her, with the backing of the U.S. military, to give up her power, and they then created a government that they named, you know, as the Hawaiian government. And so, long story short, I mean, you know, there's no way I can do justice to the whole history, right, this briefly, but there's never been an end to the struggle to maintain sovereignty and to establish self-determination.
Yeah.
And I think history kind of taught us differently for a while. And then, where is that? I don't want to say the wrong person's name, and I feel like I tend to do that. I tend to like just kind of quote fast and loose and wildly. You're going to edit these, right? You're going to edit out all my, okay. Because I'm trying to like peer on my shelf for this book that I want. Aloha Betrayed, that's what it is. So Noe Silva, who's at University of Hawaii, was in the archives and found like stacks of paper. It's actually called like the Kue petitions, right? Which means like to stand up. So she actually found this lost evidence of signatures of all. So there was a vote at one point, right? Like, do you vote for Hawaii to become a state, or do you vote for statehood? And the folks who were allowed to vote, obviously, like, let's, you know, take a wild guess at who's allowed to vote. But there's just pages and pages, stacks and stacks of signatures of Hawaiian people saying, we do not want this. We do not vote for this, right? And that was a huge find. And, you know, really kind of the evidence, I think, that folks in Hawaii who maybe were or were not part of like the ongoing struggle, like it really kind of, it was like a shot in the arm that people needed, right? Like, here's this evidence that like your ancestors said no. Right. So you know, so there's that, and it's not a how do I say this? It's not, there are many sides to this struggle, right? There are some folks who believe that statehood is best. There are some folks who actually believe in, you know, who want federal recognition, like American Indian tribes have. And interestingly, a lot of Native folks on the continent have warned us against that, right? Because it's not, what they have isn't true sovereignty. It's just, it's the pseudo sovereignty within the US. But a lot of, so when I talk about Mauna Kea, a lot of the more in the spotlight struggles that happen are around land and water, right? Access to water, protecting sacred lands, protecting the land in general. And with Mauna Kea, what's been happening is that, man, I can't. It's been so long. I'm trying to remember, like, when did this all begin? But so on Mauna Kea is the tallest mountain on the planet if you measure from the ocean floor to the top, and it's a sacred space, right? Um, there are currently 14 telescopes on Mauna Kea because of its location on the globe and because of its height, right? It's an astronomer's paradise. It's apparently the best place to put a telescope. The problem is, well, Native Hawaiians don't have any control over saying, like, you can't build here, right? The state leases these lands. But to build a telescope, you don't just set it on the ground and use it. You dig deeply into the ground, you blast into the ground, you destroy the water table, you disturb, there are species that live nowhere else on Earth, plants and animals, right? Like, it's violent. It's a violent disruption. Even if this weren't considered a sacred place, just the level of violence that is required to dig down deep enough to build these massive telescopes. So there are 14 already, and a bunch are out of commission, and there are many that are just sort of like leaking into the water table. And so they want to build the TMT stands for a 30-meter telescope, and so they want to put this 30-meter telescope there that's supposed to be just the greatest thing ever. It will allow us to see into the universe. How do they describe it? They talk about it as, like, seeing into our past. There was a lot of really racist kind of pushback against people who want to protect the land by saying, Hawaiians are anti-science, despite the fact that historically Hawaiians navigated the globe by using the stars, right? In fact, I have look at my shirt. It came from the Mauna Kea film, which is about the canoe that traversed the globe.
Wait. So can we? So is the film? Where can we see this? Where can we see this?
I think you can see. We actually had a showing here at Mills, and we had the filmmaker and some of the women who navigated the canoe here. I think you can see it. I want to say on PBS. I can get you the link, and then you can maybe, like,
Okay.
the
Yes,
link into your
please,
text.
please. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's an amazing film. So they based on the way that Hawaiians, Polynesians, traveled the globe historically. They take this canoe out, and they don't use any sort of instruments. Like, they have to learn how to read the stars and how to follow the stars and where they are at different times of the year. And so if anything, Hawaiians are not anti-science. It's just what folks, America, what white America, I guess, like, considers science is very different, and it always has to somehow be destructive, it seems, right? So far there's no telescope built on Mauna Kea. Once COVID began, people left the mountain, right? But they, prior to that, had been up there for over 100 days. Remembering offhand how many, but with just blocking the path, right? Like, you're not going to build here, right? And so yeah, I mean, in capitalism can't understand, right? Like, there's too much of a disconnect. You couldn't possibly have a healthy relationship to land and people and water, and also gung-ho support capitalism, right? They're incompatible. And
Well, okay, so
I'm
sorry, finish your thought.
Well, I was going to just say, like, so with the Dakota Access Pipeline, I think most folks are more familiar with this than they are with Mauna Kea, but essentially it's oil companies and the government wanting to build a pipeline under the ground, under water sources that goes through indigenous lands. And part of why the pipeline was planned to go through that area was because the residents in the neighboring town, which is predominantly white, had said, "You're not putting that through our town. That's dangerous, right? Like, we don't want you digging under the ground. We don't know what this is going to cause. The oil could leak." Um, and so it was too dangerous for, to go under the ground of a predominantly white city. But when they wanted to dig it through indigenous lands, there were promises like, "Oh, this is safe. This is not," So that, I mean, if your students or folks listening aren't familiar with it, there's just no shortage of video and photo and stories. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi.
um, she has leftover, what is it, like Easter candy, and so she's constantly, trying to get it all in her mouth when she knows I'm on a call. But yeah, so the Dakota Access Pipeline and that fight, I think was more widely shared on social media. But again, this was one of those moments where, people came, indigenous folks from Japan, like just from around the world came, and they were like, "We recognize this," right? Because we know we have to fight to protect our land and um, our water and our people, and like that this is all connected, right? So
So I have a question,
yeah.
because one of the things that I think is, and we spoke about this before we started recording, is about you and the fight that you have for these, for the fight you're doing for Hawaiian solidarity, the fight you're doing for Mauna Kea, the fight you're doing in solidarity, the fight you have against anti-Blackness. So can you talk about how that kind of resonates from you and where that comes from? And then also, how does that translate in terms of your teaching because you talked about how students have this sense of overwhelm, but then you talk about it through a lens of resistance, which is also a
Mhm.
fight. So can you talk about how you make those connections?
Yeah, I mean, I realized, so I also teach a few different indigenous studies or indigenous history classes at Mills, and I chose early on that, to only have um, articles and books and things and films created by indigenous scholars. That felt really important to me. But more so after, sort of like my first attempt at doing it, I realized I have to be really intentional at framing all of this through that, what, like you say, like through a lens of resistance. So one of the questions that someone asked was like, it was something like, what, tell us about a time when you had a student who was a Black girl, and I'm going to paraphrase this wrong, but it was basically like, when was a time that like you really treated them well or did something good. It was like, tell me. And most of the panel were other like Black female educators, and so I mean, the question wasn't that obnoxious, right? But for them it was different, right? So for them it was just like, I can think of so many moments where it was so important for me as a Black woman to see this person, right, to be seen with them. And so like I knew that the question like landed and was answered very differently. But for me, I kind of felt like, no matter what I say, if I heard myself saying it, I would be like, "You are such a dum dum." Like, like, because the question is really asking, tell me a time where you had a Black girl in your class and you treated her like a human being,
Mhm.
right? And so the fact that like, I think the way that, oh God, I wish I have to go back and find the video. The way the question was phrased, for me as a non-Black educator, meant that, right? Like it meant something very different than like, how does your presence as a Black woman educator uh, help you to see students and help, right? So I guess that's what I'm thinking about again, right? Like when we talk about like when folks ask like, so what is your commitment to fighting anti-Blackness, or why is that important, or how do you see a connection? The the kind of more, you know, grumpy, irritable, older me is like, you know, it's like, just, oh, my computer's trying to restart. um, my life. But you know what I mean? It's just like, it, how, how do you not fight that, right? Like, how do you, you're asking me what inspires me to want to make sure that we
Now,
can
I'm asking
collectively
you
treat
about you
people.
being a fighter.
Yeah, well, you know, I have like
Because,
20 years of experience in martial arts, so
yeah.
I'm trained to like, but that's actually not, you know, like trained to fight. That's actually trained to like prevent fights. But the thing is, so just historically speaking, you know, when the U.S. In the 19th century begins colonizing, you know, much of the ocean, right? Like the Philippines, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Guam. They used anti-Blackness as a
Mhm.
way to get the rest of the citizenry on board, right? So
Yeah.
they would talk about Hawaiians as, and there's, you know, there's even a quote about the Queen that says something like, you know, based on her features and you know comportment, it's clear that she is a descendant of the Negro, and so like they use this language of, you know, what was already under the acceptable anti-Blackness that was already part of the US in order to justify then taking lands and colonizing and killing off people across the globe, right? And so for me, and then taking this back to teaching, it's really important to get students of color and white students, but you know, like especially students of color who are not Black, to see that this has always sort of been like the strategy of the US, right?
Yes. Yes.
Because people understand it, right? We're so trained in this country. Um, it's such a quick, um, what is the word? Like it's just such a quick, like sort of like trigger response, right? Like
Mhm.
we're trained in this country to see Blackness vilified,
Yeah.
right? And so if the country then wants to um, you know, vilify another group, right? Or like get the US on board with, get the citizens on board with, like, let's say, you know, bombing Iraq, for example, right? Like we use the language of anti-Blackness. We use tropes of anti-Blackness. So you can
Yeah.
see this. So I oftentimes show my students old magazine covers or political cartoons where even during the war, in the war, the two world wars, you know, even the Irish are drawn
Yeah.
blackened, right?
Yeah.
And the Japanese, like whoever we want to vilify, we link them up with Blackness. And it's so much the language of this country, that we cannot be part of any other group fighting for freedom without acknowledging that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Yes, absolutely right. Okay. Oh my
Okay.
God. I'm so glad we recorded.
I know, me too. And you know, like I'm thinking ahead. So
No.
this fall, I'm actually not teaching Intro to Ethnic Studies, and I'm
Uh,
bummed because it's one of my favorite things. You know, brand new
yeah, I'm
cartoon.
like, I can see that, and I can see the inspiration. Like, oh my gosh, you're just so amazing. I just love you so much, and I just so appreciate you. I absolutely appreciate you, and I thank you 100% from the bottom of my heart. I'm like, whoa, we're gonna be in for a treat when you speak at the convocation. I was
Yes.
like, yes, this, and so even for that brief moment, and for our listeners, how, so you have a website, and folks can actually go there, and I'll put the link into our info so they can read more of your work and learn more about you as well. And I just appreciate you. So thank you so much.
Yeah, I appreciate you. You know, like I think you were a few years ahead of me in grad school. So you're one of the folks who, like, I kind of knew of, but didn't sit in classes with. So, you know, I always looked up to you.
Oh, you're
And
so sweet.
yeah, no, you know, and I love following the work that you're doing with San Jose State, and you know,
Sacramento State.
edit that out. Sacramento State. Sorry, you know what? I have a real problem with geography. Like, I also think anything below Fresno is LA.
Okay, well,
that just really makes people mad. And I think anything above us is Sacramento. It's really hard. So Sacramento and San Jose aren't even near each other. Yeah.
But they both start with SA.
They do. I'm gonna blame it.
I'm
gonna blame it on being from an island.
There you go.
But I have been here a long time, so I should know better.
Work that I'm doing outweighs that stress. Like they're able to see that why I'm willing to do this work. And yeah, again, like I think that it hasn't been done before, that we've valued ancestors in that way, so that I just think it's empowering. Like